Okay, I think most of you know this already. We did have a couple of people register at the last minute, so I want to make sure that I just go over and review this. So what you're going to see, if you're not familiar with this already, is these icons on the top of your screen. And you want to select the one that looks like a cartoon bubble. It's going to give you a box that looks like this, and you want to type on the bottom. If you've done it already, you don't need to repeat, but if you haven't done it already, can you put in your name and where you're from? And most of you may have done it already, so, yeah. Doug, you hit the wrong thing. He has to be the presenter. Which, if you want to do it, it's okay with me. Okay. So let me shut this down because, again, I always like to have the least stuff running, especially when I'm doing Excel, which kind of moves. Okay, so let's get started. So I know people have different levels of knowledge about this general topic, but I can kind of just ask it as a question. Okay, how many of you have at least heard of a Gantt chart? Okay. Not that you have one on the top of your lips, but at least have heard of what it is. Okay. So a Gantt chart is a way to do project planning that, I learned in graduate school and have worked with from time to time. So if you really wanted to get to the bottom of this is, or look at it a little bit away, in essence, what I'm going to do is develop a Excel-based Gantt chart, with the exception being that it's not going to be a chart, it's really going to be more in spreadsheet format. But in the essence of what we're doing is get you to the same result you would get with a Gantt chart. But personally, I think this is actually better than a Gantt chart, especially for people who work with details or numbers or projects, because it's more date-tied, okay? So let's start with just some of the basic foundational stuff that we need to begin this, and I realize a little bit of it is a repeat from what we did at the end of tips and tricks, but I'll go a little slower on this. Okay, so first let's just talk about how Excel handles dates, okay? So Excel was not the first spreadsheet program. The first one was actually VisiCalc, okay, which actually preceded Lotus 1, 2, 3, and so that was approximately, don't quote me on the exact time, but I believe it was developed in the late 60s, probably didn't come online for use until the 70s, into the early 80s. And so they were, a lot of the things that you see in spreadsheets now, and it was pretty primitive. I've actually worked with it a little bit, which dates me, but anyway, it was pretty primitive. However, a lot of the basic things that we see in spreadsheets today were built in even at that time, which was the whole cell address where, the columns were letters and the numbers, and a lot of the really basic formulas really came from that time. So and you can look it up if you're interested, but at the time they wanted to look at how it would handle date, how VisiCalc, ultimately how Excel would handle dates. And so they made a convention decision. They said, if we really treat date more as a filter, almost like percents, or, it's kind of a way of looking at it, but really had an underlying number, what number would that be? So they somewhat arbitrarily assigned that number, the number 1, to 1/1/1900, figuring that's approximately 70 years earlier. So this only works with dates that are 1/1/1900 or beyond, so it's useless if you're like a historian, okay? But this was really principally designed as a business tool, so I don't think they were worried too much about that. So basically what they said, and I know, Joe, you asked me this question when we did the session, I believe it was on Monday. You have to put in 1900 or it won't know. It'll think you probably mean 2000. So if you do that, you may not see any difference until you go up to the top to where your formatting is. And if you convert that to general, you're going to see that that's a number 1. Now, I'm just going to do one just quick change here. I'll take it back to date again, or I'll just do it below. So if you see if it's 1/2/1900, that's going to be a 2. Okay? And likewise, if we have, I believe today, I don't know if today's the 26th or the 27th, but I think it's the 26th. But I'll do yesterday. So if we have yesterday, that's going to give you 43,915, which is the number of days that have been since 1900, like a lot of trivia that you probably don't need. However, by the way, if you ever from time to time hit a date and you're getting a number like 43,000, it's because the format's on general rather than date. Because if I now switch this to date, it'll go back to the date. Okay. So why is that important? Because once Excel treats a date as a number, then you can manipulate those numbers. And the beautiful thing about this is all of the manipulation going to do is really simple. It's mostly, we're only actually going to do 2 functions in this whole thing, besides some fancy schmancy things to make it look better. But in the essence of this, you really only need 2 things, actually 3. Addition, subtraction, and the max function. Okay? Those are the only 3 that you need, all that we covered in tips and tricks. Okay? So let's start and talk about how that would work really specifically. Okay? So let's say that we have 2 dates. And by the way, I apologize. After I looked at the spreadsheet, I realized I really hadn't updated it to newer dates. So what you're going to see here has some updates. But you can easily change that. So a lot of them are 18 and 19, and I changed it up. But anyway, let's take a look at this. So if we had an event, which could be a work order or a purchase order or a sale or even a project planning date, okay? And that date was 12/13/19, and we wanted to know how many days there were in between 12/13/19 and 1/7/20. It's a simple math problem. You take your later date, you definitely want to start with the later date, and subtract it from the earlier date, and that's going to give you the number of days in between. So let's say instead of this being 1/17, it was 3/26. So that would be 104 days. So if this was, we would hope this would not be the case, but if this were a work order and that was generated on 12/19 and it's now 3/26 and it's still open, it means it's been open for 104 days. So what this is called is aging. You're essentially aging the event. And the most common use of this in industry is to age accounts receivables. In fact, I do some aging of accounts receivables in some of my client districts as well. It's not as big because we don't have that many, general receivables. But I was just working in a district just before the world came to an end on dealing with billing other districts for health and welfare and for foster kids. And we were aging the receivables to see what the story was on why we hadn't been paid for some of them. So it does have applications in the public sector as well, and certainly in project tracking. Okay, so these are just a few other examples of this again, but it's a simple math problem. Just remember, you always start with your later date, or you're going to get negative numbers when you don't want a negative number. Okay, so let me stop. Any questions? You're all good with that? Okay, not really hard. Okay, so there is one thing that helps with this, and that is this first one I've showed you here is static. What do I mean by static? Well, it has today's date as 2/13/20. Well, today's date isn't 2/13/20. So there is this really neat function in Excel, and it's called the equals today function. and it has no parameters. So even though it carries the same syntax as function, there's nothing in between the parentheses because there's no parameter, okay? And so what happens is, if you do it, and I can just do it here so you can see it. If I do equals today, got to spell it right, though. That's the only rule. It's going to return today's date. Now, what's really cool is if you open this very same spreadsheet tomorrow, it's going to show 3/27. So if you are, for example, aging, you don't have to constantly update what your date is. It's going to be done automatically. So you're getting real-time information on where you are as of today. So unless you're generating a report like receivables as of the end of March or the end of February, where you want it by a particular cutoff date, the most common thing to do is to use today instead. So what I would do here is, instead of having this, I would have equals today. And as you see it put in today's date, I would do that for all of them. And if this clicks over tomorrow, this would become, instead of 7980, okay, until such time as it was resolved, okay? So again, here's an example of it with today, okay? So that is when we're trying to compare the dates between two dates, okay? And here we use subtraction. But we can also do problems that involve addition. So, for example, and I can actually change this to today's date. So if I have something that happened today and I want to know, what is 45 days from today, that's going to be 5/10/20, okay? So by using addition, all I'm doing is taking today's date, which is a number, it's 43 something, and I'm adding 45 to it, and then that's going to give me this result. Every once in a while when you do this, you're going to get like 43, whatever. Just make sure that you convert, how it looks if you get any 43s to date, to the date function. Because again, in the background, this is what Excel sees it as, but that gets converted into a date. Okay, so every once in a while, based on how you copy, you may have to switch that. Okay, so now we know how to figure out the differences between dates, and we know how to add, kind of estimate. So let's look at what this possibly means before I give you a really specific example. Okay, suppose that we know we have something that we cannot start before 3/26/20. Maybe it's because we're looking for a rate that's coming from the state. Or this date is actually the start of the school year, and I'm not allowed to do anything until the start of the school year. Or it's the first of the year. So if I figure that task takes 45 days to do, what's my estimated date when that item is going to be completed? Well, I would expect it to be completed on 5/10. So what I want you to do as you think about this is to just think about this notion that we budget for money, but we can actually budget for time. Because when I say it's going to be 45 days, that's like a time budget. Budgets and actuals are not always the same. But if I have a budget, then I can track whether or not things happened as planned, okay? And that turns out to be really powerful, okay? So again, I'm going to stop. Any questions so far? I know I'm talking a lot and not showing as much, but I'm going to show you more. Okay, so what I want to talk about next is the difference between a linear and a nonlinear project. And I will tell you that it's rare that you get a complicated project that's linear, Although I do have an example. I use this in one of the districts I work with, and we're doing planning for how we're going to build for foster kids. And it's pretty linear. Well, except at the end, when we have to wait for the actual rate from the state, because we're billing based on estimated rates. But for the most part, it's linear. And so I'm going to show you a linear project and show you what each one of these columns mean, because I've added a little bit of nuance to this. Okay. So the first thing is, when you're going to do a project, it's important that you label each task. And it's completely up to you. I would recommend either you label by number or you label by letter. In this particular one, I labeled by letter, okay? And so you start out, the first simplest thing is you have to be able to identify the steps in the tasks. I mean, if you're going to do a project, you got to figure out what the steps are, okay? And then you want to just label them straight down, A, B, C, D, E, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? And then the next step is to say, starting with the second task, what is it dependent on? So in a linear project, the next item is always dependent on the one before. So if you look at this, it almost looks like the same list offset by one. But that makes sense, because I can't do the bids till I do the scope of the project, okay? I can't get board approval until I do the bids, okay? And then I can't hire the contractor till the board approves. And they can't I can't inspect the work till it's completed, okay? So this is probably too simple. There's probably a lot more steps in this. But I want to point out that this is a linear project, okay? And so we don't really need in a linear project anything more than addition and subtraction. Next, I'm going to show you a nonlinear project. It's actually not that much harder, but it's important that you understand the difference. So let's look linear first. Just like if you're doing advanced math, you usually start with linear, and then you'll go to variable. So we're going to start with linear, and I'm just going to explain what everything is. Okay, so we have to have what is a start date for our project, which I've just randomly done here, 2/13/20. And then how long does it take to do each task? This is an estimate, okay? It's an estimate, okay? So I'm estimating it typically takes me 10 days. And by the way, just like anything else, you can have an ambitious estimate or you can have a conservative estimate. Maybe you really figure it takes 5 days, but you build it into 10, okay? And I have no problem with that. I almost recommend doing that, okay? So now this number, this gets calculated by simply adding this plus this. That date plus 10, and that gives me this date. Now, as to how I get in a linear project this date, it's a cell reference. So since I can start the next project as soon as the previous one is completed, all I have to do is equals and do a reference. So this is dependent on this. It's just a repeat of the number. And again, I'll just show you how you do that. You just do this equals to G12, okay? And then again, I'm adding. Just the two are getting added. And then lo and behold, this equals to this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to the end of the project, okay? So now, watch what happens. Maybe we plan to do the scope of the project on 2/13, but, we're waiting, we're waiting on some information, or we have to have a meeting about it, or, somebody wants for some reason, we have to wait on the scope of the project, right? So, and how many of you have had this? The good intentions being what they are, all of a sudden there's a crisis, like a pandemic. No, there's a crisis or a situation, and we get sidetracked, and what was originally going to be the start date, it gets moved forward a month, Okay? It's not unusual. Okay? So by the way, just a point, okay? As of today, the completion of this project, if everything goes well, is on 4/28. Okay? On 4/28. Now, so let's say that we have a change. And this now becomes 3/15. That automatically revises all of the other dates because everything's dependent on each other. So think of it like a snake, okay? If you change the start, all of it gets changed. So even on a linear project, let's talk about the benefits that come from being able to do this. And this is more talking than about Excel, but I have enough time to cover everything, okay? Okay, so let me just tell you what my experience has been sometimes working for folks. They would tell us, you know, the new offices are going to be completed on January 1, and we'd be told about this, and somewhere along, I don't know, maybe a week before, they would notify us that they're like 2 months behind, okay? And it didn't go well politically. Now, unfortunately, you can't always control what happens. But if you're not able to tell people that that there's a significant change that's anticipated early, you're going to probably have more of a negative reaction. So if you promised that something was going to be done by June 30th, and you already know in March that it's not going to be done till September, you're better off telling people earlier. And this allows you to do that. This allows you to make a determination. Now, depending on the extent to which you promised and delivered, that's a different story. So if I told them already it would be September, even though because you never get blamed if you do things sooner, okay, for the most part. So if I had already built in a little wiggle room, then I might not have to let them know, and if it's only a couple of days, I don't have to. But I think what's fundamental here is at any given time where you are with your project based on what's happened, assuming that all the assumptions are correct. Okay? So let me stop. Any questions so far? Okay. And it isn't very complicated, especially if you have the template. Okay, so now let's go to the next piece of this, which is my invention, sort of, but really not. Because all I did was take the very same concepts that I would use with budgeting, financial budgeting, and I applied it to time budgeting. By the way, if you have experience in doing variance reports for money, doing them for time is about the same mathematically. Because remember, it treats dates as numbers. Okay? So here we have our variance report, okay, or variance information, and I'll explain how it works. So one of the things that's really critical is that it be in real time. And by the way, you actually don't have to have this column. You could build it into the formulas, or if you like having the column, you could hide it. But, this is just the today function. So again, if I turn this around tomorrow, these are all going to be 326, okay? So I'm just going to make one small change here to make a point. Let's assume I don't get started until, yesterday, okay? Okay, so if I don't get started until yesterday, then this tells me how many days I have left until I'm going to be late. Okay. So when I refer to that, and that parlance of language comes from Per Charts and Gannett, I refer to that as slack. It's how much extra time we have so far to get the item done. Now, it's possible that we had an estimated completion date of 4/4. We'll do it earlier. But Every day that's ticking down. So when I look at my project, I usually don't look at the 5th item down right now. I'm going to look at the next 2. And as a manager, if you're doing this with your team, when you're hitting under 10 days, you're calling that, well, this one's only a 10-day item. But if you've got an item where originally was 40 days and you're hitting 10, that's when you're emailing somebody and saying, what's the story? Are we on track or are we not on track? And then at that point, what do we want to do? Do we want to hustle it up? Do we want to revise our estimates? Do we want to add more days, which is going to evict the snake down to the completion, or we want to pressure folks to get it done so we can stay on target? So it becomes a way to manage the information. So my use of the terminology is my own, is if it's a positive number, it's slack, kind of extra, wiggle room. Once we go negative, it's a variance, okay? And so again, I'm just going to change the first date so you'll see what that looks like on just this one item. Notice that that's now a negative number. Now, I did go over this, just some stuff so you could, make it a little prettier or fancier. I could add conditional formatting to this. And in fact, hold on one second. I'll just do it so you see it once. This is for the fancy among us, okay? I can say anytime it's less than 5 days, I want it in red. And so now if I'm looking, the moment I see, even 5 days, and there's an error there. It actually shouldn't be red at 6. I got to figure out what's wrong there. But anyway, you could also build in some visual warnings once you hit below a certain point. I don't know why that's... I don't know. I'm not going to worry about it because it's really not the topic, okay? I would have fixed that. But I just want to point out you could build in, or maybe you'll just do it so that as soon as it, hits 0, where you're in the negative, just do less than 0. Now, in this case, none of them are, but let's say this had been, then these are going to be negative, and that's still an error. I'm going to figure out what's going on with this. But anyway, you get my idea. Don't worry about that. Okay. So that's how you measure slack and variance. I'm going to stop again and ask everybody good, any questions, anything so far? Okay. So, as I had mentioned, I initially did this for a company that I work with. In fact, Joe, you may even know them because they're Long Island based. ECG Group. Do you know ECG Group? Kendra? It's been wonderful working with them. But anyway, so I actually work with her team on this. This is how she's keeping track of all of her various projects now. Okay, and they actually have a tab for each project. So one of Kendra's innovation in this was she said, I also want to, after we finish a project, I want to also be able to do some analysis, okay, to see what happened. So what she said is when we do our original estimated dates, let's copy them over not as formulas, but as actual values. So then at some point, we can almost do like you would do with a budget. Why were we over or under, okay? And then actually be able to compare what with the original date, which was 2/23, to this, figure out a variance for that, and then at that point say, okay, what was the cause? Was it a vendor that gave me an inaccurate information on how long a project was done? Was it a board that dawdled? Was it, whatever it was, and then figure out to what extent we can control that. Maybe if we sent more reminders, maybe we could work on getting a little better, either more reliable data, because if the actuals are longer than 10 days, then we may have to revise our estimates in the future, or hustling it up or applying reminders. So we began to use it as a real management tool to decide how to strategize to move the projects along. So again, if you're doing it for one particular project, I'm not so sure I'd really care about this. But if it's some sort of an ongoing process, then it makes sense where it's going to be repeated with multiple places. It makes some logical sense to do a post-project analysis and see what we've learned. Even if nothing else, it's uncontrollable, let's revise our estimates. Okay? So does what I'm saying make sense? So you don't really need this part here to track the project. It's more to analyze it post-project. That's really the purpose. Okay? So that's a linear project. And the next one we'll show you is nonlinear. But again, it's not too crazy. Even in nonlinear projects, most of the tasks may still be linear. I mean, unless you're like doing, like a space, something like a moonshot, where, oh my God, I can't even imagine how complicated that would be, But, if, in most public sector projects, they're not that crazy. So you might only have a couple of situations where it's nonlinear. Most of it is still linear. So let me show you what that looks like in this next one. And it's really the same basic idea. It's a project, and it's, going over common public sector steps, okay? So I'm just going to explain it to you, okay? So here, again, first step, always number or letter your items, okay? So you just identify the steps and you letter your items. And once again, you got to figure out about how much time it takes based on past experience for each item. Okay. So let's just look what happens here, because I purposely highlighted in yellow so you would see where it isn't linear. Okay. So here, B is dependent on A. Okay. C is dependent on D. But D is also dependent on B. So D isn't dependent on C. I could start D even if I hadn't gotten C completed. Okay? So I want to make sure you all understand what I'm talking about here. Okay? So I could get board approval after I get the bids. I don't have to wait to submit the request to the state. Eventually I need that, but I don't need that to have the board approve it. I just need them to have the bids that, and we've selected the vendor based on low cost, okay? So here's a classic example where it's not straight linear, okay? And then this next one is really interesting. I can't award and sign the contract unless both C has been done and D. So I'm dependent on both, okay? So let's walk this through and see what happens, okay? And again, you have the template, so, so you can certainly play with all the numbers. And again, I'm just going to move this up so they're a little bit more current. Let's do 320. Not that it matters in this case, because I'm not here listing the variance yet, okay? I'm just showing you the basic snake, okay? So here we have a situation, and actually let me make sure these are dependent. Yes, they are. Okay, so let me take you through this. Okay, so 313 plus 10 is 323. Since that's a linear step, that's just this to this. That gives me 47. Now my next task, and you just have to look at it, what is task B dependent on, okay? Actually, what is task C dependent on? It's dependent on B. So I'm going to link it to here. When I get to my next task, it's not dependent on this. It's dependent also on B. So both of these link to the same place, and that's why we're getting the same number. They are dependent on B. Okay? So far, we don't really even have to deal with anything except addition and linking. It doesn't require anything else until we get to C and D. Here is where it gets a little more complicated. Okay? So I'm going to first show you the formula, and then I'll show you how it works. And it's still not complicated. Okay? It's still pretty easy. So here, I'm using a function called the max function. Okay? Because the event is dependent on the later of the two dates. So look at the date here. This event, and actually I'll mark it out, you'll see it in the colors. This event, based on the estimate, won't be completed till July 6th. This will be completed by May 5th, May 7th. So the soonest I can start this task is July 6th, because they both have to have taken place before I can move to the next step. Okay? So let me go over with you the max function. It's such a simple function. Okay? And I've written it out. I'm repeating it here. Okay? So if you remember, we did the max function this way. As a range. And of course the answer is going to be 25. That's the higher of the three numbers. Okay? Another way I could have written this, it takes a little bit longer, is I could have said this, comma this, comma this. And I'm still going to get 25, so I could have done them individually. So even not doing any referencing, look at this, okay? So if I have 8 and I have 5, just built in, I'll just make it bigger. That's going to return a result of 8 because it's given two numbers, it's going to give you the higher of the two. Okay? So now, remember that dates are just numbers. So if I have 7, 11, 20, and I have 5 or 6, 11, 20, and I just do the reference to them, so you have to guess, what is it going to give me as the result before I hit enter? This way I make sure you're all alive. Exactly. Now, see what I mean? Sometimes it'll show up as a number. If it does that, just switch it to date. And that gives you your date. Okay? So if you get any 43,000s, you know, it's just because it did the subtraction without converting it back to a number. Okay? So now, look how this works. So here, I'm saying give me the later of these two dates. And that's why I can't begin this next step until this is done. Now, this is very simple. This only involves 2. Maybe there are 3 steps that have to happen before I can do that next phase. We're not limited, but I don't want to make you too crazy here, okay, in terms of understanding it. But really, once you get the basic idea and you lay it out, it really isn't that difficult. And the key is actually this. You have to start by getting this down. Once you get this down, doing this is fine. If you don't first understand the dependencies, you're going to go out of your mind, okay? So absolutely, first step I always do in a project is label everything, then I figure out what's dependent on what, and then I just make sure I didn't make any errors. Okay? All right? You with me so far? Okay, so here's the big kahuna, but it's actually not any different from what we already did. It's just, a little bit larger. Okay? And it's a bit of a made-up project, but it certainly could be similar. Here I use numbers. I probably should have gone back to using A, B, C, and D, but once it gets to be about 12, usually I like to use numbers. Okay, so here's my project. There are what? 12 phases in the project. I put it over here, but really, probably aesthetically, it would be better to put the column here. Okay? All right. So we can see, for the most part, the project is linear. Right? Although it doesn't necessarily mean, when I say linear, I mean that you don't have an item dependent on more than one thing. It's still possible to have two items dependent only on one thing that can skip over one. That's still considered linear. It only really becomes nonlinear when we have to hit the max function. And you don't need the max function for these. You just need to make sure you're putting the equal to the right item previously. So first you do this, then you figure out what's dependent on what, and then you roll it out, and you have your estimated times. Okay, so let's just take a look at this. I purposely highlighted in a different color the one where it's going to count. Okay, so these first few, and you'll see it here. You can see it actually. Just see it. These are just straight. Okay, so anytime you're seeing that date dependent on this date, the same date, that's a good bet. But understand here in my second item, I'm not dependent on here, I'm dependent on the first item. Okay, and actually I think there may be an error. No, because these both could start at the same time. They weren't dependent on anything, okay? So now, and that's possible. We might have a step 3 that can be started at the same time as step 1. Okay? And you can kind of see how it goes. This item, phase 5, phase 4, is dependent on phase 2, not phase 3. And again, you can see them by looking at the dependencies, taking a look at your dependencies. Okay? Now, when we get to here, phase 8 is dependent on both 6 and 7, the later of 6 and 7. So here, I have to hit a what? A max function. And that's why it's 7/18. And again, just to show you what would happen, even though it's going to end up messing up my thing, I don't care. Okay? Let's say, actually, I'm going to even make it longer. Let's say I really couldn't start this till 7. Now, that becomes the later of the two. Okay? So there's a question, by the way, about which way you want to go on adjusting stuff. My feeling is, if you've set it up and you don't have to worry about the stuff that happened before. You don't have to, or try to fudge it by playing with the numbers. If you're at phase 5 at this point and it's behind, instead of having it linked by the number, just change it to a date. Because I'm not really concerned about what happened before. I'm only concerned going forward. Okay? So I am going to change this back just to make a point. Understand, this is a complete snake. So if this got delayed a month, everything's going to be well, it may not be, depending on what's dependent on what. Let me move it up quite a bit. That's then going to affect all the dates moving forward, depending on how far ahead we are. And then again, slack and variance. How much time do we have? Okay? And obviously this is a project that hasn't even happened yet, so it's in the future, so I would expect to have a lot of slack and variance. By the way, one thing that they do at ECG Group is when they finish a phase, they strike through it. just so they don't have to look at previous items, or they color it, okay? So maybe you'll do, I don't know, anytime it's finished, you just hit a yellow. So you don't necessarily have to look at the items that have already been done. I got a couple of minutes left. Any questions? Did I make your head explode, or does it make sense? Now, you may be tempted in looking at this to say, this is kind of more complicated than a lot of the stuff I normally do. And I'll grant you that, okay? But, you can apply this to even some of the most simplest things, okay? So I'm in the process, just before, again, the world came to an end, I was working with the district on trying to estimate and do better planning on how we handle a lot of their billing processes, particularly, and this may not apply to people out of state, it's a New York thing, but there's always, okay? You could. You absolutely could. It's kind of not where I tend to go, but once you have data, you can absolutely convert it into a graph. Okay? I have generally found for tracking purposes, I work better with the numbers, but if you were reporting after the fact, or you wanted to give trends, you absolutely could track this, okay, as a graph, see where you are, okay? Or you could track the variances and say, why are those, why did those tasks go negative? So, yeah, once you have data, you can graph it. All right, so I'll just kind of explain this task, and then I'm going to take a couple of minutes to just show you, if I have time, some advanced date functions that are a little more sophisticated than this one, okay? All right, and I will tell you, by the way, unless your projects are very granular, you don't need these advanced date functions. They, for the most part, we don't worry about the fact that weekends are weekends, especially when we're tracking over long periods of time, okay? Because it's built in. If I was looking at how long it took for, on average to get my plumbers to complete a plumbing job, I would want to be able to take out the weekends and holidays, okay? So I can show you how to do that, but I'm saying for this project planning, it isn't really necessary. Okay, so let's take a situation. This is roughly what I had been working on, okay, which are the tasks you have to do in order to be able to bill. And one of the things is we can only do an estimated bill until we get the actual rate from the state. And according to what I was told, that comes out around December. But we don't want to wait that long because we want to inform, these are billing to other districts, they have to be able to encumber the funds, and we figure if they encumber in advance, we can just do an adjustment, okay? So I don't need to bore you with the details, but this is a very linear project, okay? But now I can begin to then, estimate, look, and compare. First of all, we can use it to track. I didn't actually do it here, but I can begin to then, track how many days do we have left. Now, of course, this is all stuff in advance. This was planning for next year. But let me change it to a date that's a little bit closer to now, even though it's not the actual dates we would use. So now we're seeing already, if I haven't done this yet, I'm behind, okay? Different years works because, remember, it's based on days, and the dates keep kicking up. So you actually could do that, okay? Yeah, I don't think I have enough time. Give me a call, Joe, when you have a minute. And we'll do like a 10-minute, and I'll show you what function you can use to actually calculate. A more common thing is pulling out the year from a date, so we can determine when people, pulling out a year from a date, so we can determine what year they can retire or vest without having to go through crazy stuff, because there is a method for doing that, for pulling the year out. And once you pull the year out, if you know the year they started, you can figure out how many years they're in. Okay? So I think that's what you were probably asking me about, because that's normally the business office use, okay, or the HR use, okay? So just email me and let me know when you have time, okay? All right, yeah, okay. So we have to do another one, okay? So okay, so I think you get the general idea here. Okay, so let me just show you some advanced date functions. So the first one I actually can show you. Okay, so there is a function called a year function. Okay, so, and that is the one for both Donna and Joe that would do it for you. Okay, so I'm not laying out the whole problem, but I can certainly show you how to do this. Okay, so let's say that I had a person and I don't know, they are, I know today's date, but I want to know what their start date was or their start year, okay? So let's say they started in 3/11/87, 88, okay? So I want to be able to pull the 88 out of that, okay, without having to, like, go through a lot of hoops, right? So the way you can do that is to do the year function. And that'll pull the year out, okay? That tells you the year. And then you can do the same thing with this year, and then do subtraction. You can figure out how many years it's been that they've worked, okay? Does that make sense? Now, there's also a month one. If you do the one that's the days, you're going to get the very same result as if you just do what we do with the subtraction. But that probably is the function that would do that. And I gave you a good example of it here, actually. You want to calculate, Medicaid, when they're eligible for Medicaid, right? So you have their date of birth, you pull the year out, you add 65 to it, and then you can rebuild the date back in, okay? And so they would be eligible for Medicaid, assuming it isn't at the start of the year, it's on the actual date. I believe on Medicaid, it's based Medicare, not Medicaid. On Medicare, it's your actual date of birth date, not the start of that year. So these would be all the years based on whatever you put in when you're calculating. All right? Got it? I think that's about, I'll just run through the other ones. Okay. So this one calculates the number of days between, the number of days or months or years between two dates. If you have those two dates, without having to go through as many hoops. So it's basically what I did up above without having to do the subtraction, a dated if. And that would tell you, this is 43 years, this is 446 years, that's crazy, but anyway, that's got to be an error. Okay, no, that's months, 446 months, 83,000 days. Okay, so I think we're just about over. I'm only going to tell you what it is, but I don't have time to do it. I am, by the way, I'll tell both of you, I am planning to do an Excel series that's going to be sponsored by Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES. We're going to roll it out next week. I'm going to cover this in much more advanced form, and so if you or any of your staff are interested in signing up, it's pretty reasonable, and it will do a whole session on this, okay, on dates. So there is a workday function and a net workday function, and one of the things that's good about them is they allow you to build in holidays. So it takes out weekends automatically, and you can exclude holidays. So the only thing that I can think of that's a good example of this would be, suppose you wanted a budget for fuel costs for transportation. So you want to know actually how many school days we're going to be running the buses this month. And what I want to do is, yes, I'm actually going to push it out to everybody, okay, when we have it done. I'm hoping in a few days, okay? But anyway, if you wanted to be able to do that, let's say you wanted to calculate how much, you knew on average what each bus used in terms of fuel on average, because obviously it's going to vary on how many miles it drives. But let's say we have an estimate. And then I wanted to be able to calculate how many school days there were this month without having to stand at the calendar and count them, okay? So obviously I got to take out weekends. We don't work on weekends. And I need to be able to take out any school holidays, okay? So then at that point, I can then actually take my whole calendar and provide all my holidays for the whole year and put it down as a range, and it'll take all those days out. Won't account for snow days, but you could always adapt that. But any of the things that were in the regular calendar, and then you can actually calculate reliable days. And there's a limit to this limitation. It only works for a Monday to Friday business, but schools are, for the most part, Monday to Friday businesses. So for a lot of uses, if you wanted to figure out how many school days, how many days we have to provide meals to students, that's I'm giving you the template I already did. Okay, so yes, absolutely. Okay. So that's it. I think we should call it. I have another one coming up in an hour. I do have some news for you. Yes, I am going to be doing a Excel series. It's going to be sponsored by Putnam North and Westchester BOCES. Normally I would do one a month, but with schools closed, we'll probably do one a week. Probably the first one will be tips and tricks, but then beyond that, we're going to get deeper in all of these. And I'm also doing one, unfortunately I can't let you in on that one because we're almost full anyway, but I'm also doing the same series for New Jersey ASBO, and I just got an email while we were doing this that we're doing 2 sessions. We're full on the first one, and that's 190 people, and we're looking to fill the second one. So, so I'm excited. It's the only way I'm going to eat while schools are closed. So I'll be pushing it out. If any of you are interested, let me know. Send me an email. I'll probably push it out to everyone, but I'm trying to gauge interest, okay? And if you're in New York, it's Aidable. Everybody else probably doesn't know or care what that is, but if you're in New York, you know what that is, okay? So that's the story, okay? And we'll let you know. Thanks again, okay? Hope you found this helpful.